Let me start by saying that few functions of state government fail to cross the desks of state attorneys general, from public safety to civil rights. In the case of our first speaker today, Josh Kaul, the 45th Attorney General of Wisconsin, the work seems to mount by the day, even by the moment. Last week, Kaul's office filed a lawsuit to effectively block a vote to remove the state's nonpartisan elections chief, with a presidential election looming just next year. His office is also challenging a 1849 abortion ban, even as providers moved Monday to restart access to abortion. Given the breadth and magnitude of the issues piled on his plate, the Attorney General may be thinking about his days as a federal prosecutor back in Baltimore, where he pursued murderers, gang members, and drug traffickers as perhaps the easiest time of his career. But we are honored that he found time this morning to speak with us, spend time with us, to offer a view from the front lines of state government. And it's my pleasure to introduce to you Attorney General Josh Kaul.
Thank you. Well, thank you, first of all, and good morning, everybody. It's great to have you in Wisconsin. Apologies for the rain we have today, but we're glad you're all able to join us here to talk about some really significant issues. You just alluded to a couple of these things, but in Wisconsin, the nonpartisan administrator of our Wisconsin Elections Commission a vote was taken on her non-appointment, really, trying to remove her from office, and a suit was filed by my office in response to that. Planned Parenthood announced that it is resuming providing access to safe and legal abortion in Wisconsin after it had been denied for more than a year in the state because of confusion relating to a law that dates back to 1849. And Wisconsin, which has been heavily gerrymandered for over a decade, suddenly, in light of a change to our state Supreme Court, is seeing our majority in the legislature that had opposed nonpartisan redistricting for years propose a new nonpartisan redistricting model that I have some significant concerns with, but that was a significant change, and legislation was passed in our assembly. It is pending in our state Senate that would potentially put in place a new redistricting model. That all happened last week, Thursday, in one day in Wisconsin. I saw a comment that said that Wisconsin is the politics version of everything everywhere all at once. And I know the feeling, and last Thursday was maybe the starkest example, but certainly not the only one. So I appreciate that you all came here so you can hear about some of the things going on here, and what happens here is so emblematic of what happens around the country, both because Wisconsin, like Georgia and a few other states, is really at the center of American politics. We were the tipping point state in the last two presidential elections. I was elected in 2018 for the first time by a margin of 0.65 percentage points. I'm not going to brag, but I doubled my margin in the last election. I won by 1.3 percentage points. Those are the kinds of margins we have in the state of Wisconsin. 4 of our last 6 presidential elections were decided by less than 1 percentage point. So what happens here often shapes what happens in the nation. But it's not just because we're a state that is so evenly divided politically. It's also because we're a state where a lot of what happens here becomes a model for what happens in other states and around the country. So there's a lot to talk about. And in thinking about what I wanted to comment on today, the topic that really rose to the fore for me was our democracy. Now I had not realized at the time that you're going to be hearing from some administrators who've been at the center of the storm on elections recently, but in the spirit of the saying that everything's been said, but not everybody has said it yet, I figured I would add my comments about what's happening with democracy. So in Wisconsin, the battle over access to the polls and power between voters and elected officials has really been ongoing for years. In 2011, Wisconsin adopted what is, in a lot of places, considered the most or one of the most extreme partisan gerrymanders in the history of the country. That gerrymander was reinforced and updated a couple of years ago. And in addition to the influence that that's had on the ability of Wisconsinites to shape the direction of our state government, there have been a number of other efforts to reduce the power of voters and to ultimately give more power to elected officials. We had a nationally recognized government accountability board. It had been identified in a law review article as a national model. And in 2015, that board was eliminated through legislation. What was created at the time is the Wisconsin Elections Commission, and I understand you're going to hear from Meagan Wolfe, the administrator of that commission, later on. So that commission was created in 2015. In 2018, our current governor, Tony Evers, and I were elected to office. That was a shift in the partisan makeup in the governor's office and in the AG's office. And after our election, there was talk of a potential lame duck session. And I was actually being interviewed by a reporter in Wisconsin during the transition period. And the idea was to talk about what my agenda was and how our policy priorities were going to go forward. And while I don't have the precise details of the conversation, the gist was this. On the side, as you know, you often chat with folks before or after an interview, this reporter said to me, I've heard some rumblings about a potential lame duck session in Wisconsin where they might take authority away from you and the governor. Do you think that's going to happen? And I said at the time, this isn't North Carolina. We're not going to have this kind of hardball politics where people take their rights away. No offense to anybody from North Carolina. And I was wrong. Shortly thereafter, the legislature came into special session. They passed legislation that reduced the authority of my office and of the governor's office. There is still, to this day, now 4.5 years later, litigation pending that relates to those issues. But what that was a direct effort to undermine what the voters had decided at the polls, to subvert the will of the voters. Now, in the lead up to the 2020 election, there were also efforts that related to access to the polls. There was an effort to purge tens of thousands of voters from our rolls in Wisconsin, which my office successfully defended against. Following the 2020 election, and I think you all probably know what happened, following the 2020 election, Wisconsin was one of the states that was at the center of efforts to overturn the results of the election. There was lawsuit after lawsuit filed. Our office defended against those suits, and we won every one of those suits, although we actually had a state Supreme Court case here where arguments were made that tens of thousands of votes should be thrown out. And that case was decided by our state Supreme Court 4-3. So unlike a lot of courts around the country, in Wisconsin we were very, very close to potentially having our results thrown into chaos. Now, following the 2020 election, our assembly appointed a former state Supreme Court Justice, Michael Gableman, to conduct a review of the election process in Wisconsin. There was some really phenomenal local reporting on that review that really got to the heart of what was going on there. It captured former Justice Gableman saying things such as that he didn't know anything about election administration in Wisconsin, even though he had been selected as the person to review the elections that took place here. That effort ultimately collapsed under scrutiny that was happening, but it was part and parcel of these attacks that we have seen. One of the things I think is a really significant story from the last few years is we really could have gone two different directions following the attacks on the election in 2020 and following the insurrection on January 6th. And I think we don't yet know what direction we will go from that. One direction would be to say, this is a major concern for our democracy. We really need to change directions. We need to ensure that this democracy not only survives but thrives. And another direction is the doubling down on these attacks that we have seen. And the story is mixed. On the bright side, in Georgia, folks who did the right thing and stood up for democracy, I think have continued to be successful. On the other hand, we've seen folks like Liz Cheney, who have been effectively removed from their party because of their efforts to defend democracy. And we've seen the spread of election denial in states around the country. Here, after that investigation imploded, I had sort of hoped that was the end of the Gableman investigation and the attacks here. But just recently, our state Senate took up this supposed appointment of our election administrator. Now, state law says that in Wisconsin, a majority of our election commissioners, there are 6 of them, need to vote to appoint an administrator. A vote was taken. 3 people voted in favor, but 3 abstained, making clear that they didn't want to put a new appointment before the Senate. And under state law, I believe it's very clear that there was no appointment effectuated. But despite that, our Senate held a hearing. Gableman himself testified, among other folks who were engaged in election denial. And our state Senate took a vote to purportedly remove our administrator. Now, she remains in office. She continues to do her job. We filed suit just moments after that vote was taken, and I'm very confident that we will win that case. But the fact of the matter is that attacks on our election system remain in effect now, and frankly are probably at a higher level than they were even going into the 2020 election. So the protection of democracy, I believe, really is the fundamental issue of this time in our nation's history. And having been involved in a lot of those efforts, at the center of those efforts for the last several years, there are a few lessons I think we can draw from them that are relevant not only to what we do in the policy realm, but also to what the press does. So first, I think it's important to make the point that history matters. Now, my grandpa was a history teacher, so I grew up with the adage that those who forget their history are doomed to repeat it. But that adage has taken on much more urgency in the last few years than it has historically. If you look at what has been happening, for example, with the targeting of vulnerable minority groups in this country, it's important that Americans know the historical parallels that are happening when we talk about the targeting of immigrants, the targeting of transgender individuals, but also the LGBT community more generally, the targeting of the press, who have been called by certain political actors enemies of the state, the targeting of neutral election administration. There are historical parallels for what's happening here, and there is real danger that goes with that kind of targeting of individuals. Highlighting the similarities between what we have seen from certain political actors and what's happened in other countries, sometimes in autocratic regimes, I think is vitally important as we have a national discussion about democracy and what the future of this nation holds. Another area that I think is critical, and this is a similar point but slightly different, is that context matters. I just mentioned the example with Meagan Wolfe, and I want to preface this by saying we are fortunate in Wisconsin to have extraordinary folks working in the press, but this story I think exemplifies a lot of what happens around the country. When this vote was taken on the administrator, one of the headlines that I saw, and this is not verbatim, but it gives you the sense, is Senate votes to fire Administrator Wolfe. Now, if you're a citizen reading that, you probably would think from that headline, and let's be honest, nobody reads past the headlines, right? I can't say that in front of journalists, but a lot of the news people is getting is from the headlines. What you'd come away from that thinking is there's going to be a new election administrator, right? But in fact, to me, the story is the legislature, which less than 10 years ago created this new commission, the same legislators are now saying it has failed, that we need to appoint a new administrator, not just the first time they've taken that position with respect to administrator, And they're so committed to reinforcing the big lie that they have taken a vote that they have no legal authority to take, just to make the point that they want to fire this election administrator. Now, to me, that context fundamentally changes the interpretation of the story and gives a much clearer picture of what's happening. Similarly, the facts matter. Now, I don't need to tell reporters that, but I do think that the dynamic that you are all operating in has fundamentally changed from the dynamic that existed a few decades ago. There are political actors who have taken the message that the consequences of dishonesty or of statements that have, that are not consistent with their values, the consequences are outweighed by the benefits to them. There was one of the famous statements from the former president, I believe to the Attorney General at the time, that you indicate that there are questions about the election results. The House Republicans and I will take care of the rest. The notion that the balanced presentation of political disputes will help us get at the truth, I don't think holds anymore. If you've got somebody who is giving you an honest recitation of what happened and somebody who is giving you a baseless one, presenting those as two alternatives is not presenting readers and citizens with a balanced recitation of what the arguments are. Getting at the truth of what has happened, whether it is about the quality of election administration, about fraud, and there's been incredible reporting on the lack of voter fraud and the baselessness of the claims that have been made, I think really is critical to getting at the truth of the challenges we're facing and to ensuring that citizens have as much information as possible as they make decisions about the motives behind what political actors are saying and doing. So it is a weighty time, but I will say one thing. I am often asked what my favorite part of the job is, and the answer is easy, actually. I love traveling around and talking to folks about the challenges they face, about the issues that they see, about the concerns that they have. First, you just learn so much from talking to people about what's going on in their lives and their communities. But it's also incredibly inspiring to talk to people, regardless of their political views, regardless of where they live. People consistently care about their communities. They care about their family and their friends. They want their kids to go to good schools. They want their friends' families to succeed. They want their communities to thrive. It is really encouraging to talk to folks as to what the future holds. And the more that I think folks have good information because of the work that you do, the better off we're going to be. And then last, before I open up for questions, I just want to say thank you to all of you for the work that you do. It is not an easy occupation that you are in. It is, much like the election administrators you're going to hear from, you are often the targets of politically motivated attacks and attacks that are launched not because of the work you're doing, but with other motives in mind. And it's vital that despite the challenges we're facing from certain political actors, despite the financial challenges that the journalism industry is facing, that our citizens continue to have informed coverage of critical events of the day. So thank you for what you're doing, and with that, happy to open up for questions.
Sure. If you want to take a seat here, right in the firing line, that'd be fine, or wherever you're comfortable. I just wanted to remind everybody, given the nuggets that we just heard today, there's a lot of news in there, and this is all on the record. So be mindful of that, and I hope you brought a number of questions with you today. So with that, I'll just turn it over to you and your questions.
Hi, thanks so much for giving us your time today. Alex Degman, WBEZ in Chicago. So in Illinois, we have an interesting thing going on, and I guess it's not unique to Illinois, but we recently had, within the last couple of weeks, we had an elected Supreme Court justice give a keynote speech to an organization of Democrats, and the state Republican Party, well, they noticed it, and they made a big deal about it. They sent out press releases, but earlier this summer, during Republican Day at the Illinois State Fair, we had Lisa Holder White, basically a Supreme Court justice, tell a gathering of Republicans, I'm your representative on the court. I'm your candidate. So I mean, we're clearly at a point where the judiciary is politicized, and I don't know if there's any way to get around that. So as we go forward, when we cover the courts and we cover things like that, is there a way that we should be doing that to take this into account, that the judiciary, whether we like it or not, is politicized at this point?
Yeah, it's a great question. You know, and I'll reflect a bit on what's happened here in Wisconsin. You know, there has been a fundamental shift in the way that justices campaign for office. You know, I certainly think there are a lot of benefits to the federal system where judges and justices are appointed, but let's not pretend like the federal system hasn't also been far more politicized recently than it had been in the past. One of the things that I think is heightening the politicization we are seeing is the central role that the courts have been playing in some policy issues. I mean, obviously, for decades, abortion has been the focus of a lot of what's happened at the U.S. Supreme Court, and in particular with nominations. But here in Wisconsin, our court elections historically were relatively nonpartisan. Judicial candidates usually would brag about their independence and their neutrality, and a few things have happened. One is the rise of money in politics has shaped the way that elections unfold. Another thing is I believe that our gerrymander in Wisconsin is at the heart of what has happened with our court elections. And part of the reason for that is that voters have lost the ability to shape policy in the state through legislative elections. Take abortion access, for example. Wisconsinites overwhelmingly support access to safe and legal abortion, and our legislature won't even hold a hearing on that issue in the wake of Dobbs, despite the confusion that we've seen. And that's one of a number of issues. But I do think that as voters have lost the ability to influence the way our legislature is composed, there's been a hunger to have an ability to shape the way that policy decisions are being made, and that has played out in our state Supreme Court elections. So what we began to see is a shift where candidates would speak at partisan conventions. In Wisconsin, our justices and our judges are elected on a nonpartisan basis, but there's rarely much confusion about whether which party a candidate would likely align with. So candidates have begun speaking at political conventions. The races themselves have taken on a more partisan tone. We saw an election actually in, I believe it was 2019, when Justice Hagedorn was elected, where the more progressive candidate ran what I think is a traditional judicial campaign. She talked about all the endorsements she had received from judges. She talked about her independence. And it was conservative turnout that was up in that election and not progressive turnout. There are lots of reasons that may have been the case. But that model of campaigning seems to have fallen out of favor. Now, it's my hope that here, if we fix our gerrymander and voters are able to elect legislators in a way that will translate into policy change, that the court will end up sort of returning to a more typical role. Our elections will be more nonpartisan. But once you have this disconnect between what the voters want and what their legislative outcomes are producing, the idea that the judges in interpreting the laws passed by the non-representative legislature is effectuating the will of the voters is not as simple and straightforward as it is when you've got fair elections. So I do hope that we will see a return to some more neutrality. I think some of what's going on at the U.S. Supreme Court right now is push and pull between those who want to see sweeping change at the U.S. Supreme Court and others who have taken a more institutional view, like the Chief Justice. And so I think that how those debates play out remains to be seen. But it's influenced by lots of factors. I mean, justices and judges make decisions based on the facts and the law, of course, but they also read the newspapers. And there's no doubt that the Dobbs decision has had an enormous impact on politics in this country. And so I think we will continue to see back and forth happening. But to get back to your specific example, what happens in response to those circumstances, I think will shape what happens in the future. If that sort of partisanship is rewarded, then you're going to see more of it, and if it's not, then you may see less of it.
Good morning, AG. Good to see you.
Yeah.
A lot of buzz with impeachment around Janet Protasewicz here in Wisconsin. If she is impeached, do you think that, the crime or the corruption that they would be alleging would be subject to judicial review? Would a court be able to weigh in to say if she's committed an impeachable offense or not?
Yeah, well, first, I'm glad you mentioned this, because in my litany of attacks on democracy, I forgot to mention the big ongoing one, which is we just had an election this past spring for a Supreme Court seat. The new justice was seated about a month and a half ago, and there are threats to impeach that newly elected justice, who was elected by 11 points. I told you about my margins before, so 11 points in that perspective is pretty remarkable. I think there is, if there is in fact an impeachment effort that goes forward, I think there is almost certainly going to be litigation, quite possibly in multiple different forums. There are some significant issues that have come up in the public discourse. One is that the U.S. Supreme Court has previously weighed in favor of judges' First Amendment rights as candidates to address issues of public policy in Minnesota Republican Party versus White. The statements that were made in that case, by the way, were very different and much more specific than anything that came up during the most recent state Supreme Court election in Wisconsin. And so there's a potential First Amendment issue we could see litigated. The standard under our state constitution is, for impeachment, is either corrupt conduct, which means basically bribery, that's historically what it meant, or misdemeanors and other crimes. And we're not anywhere close to any of those things. And so under the plain language of our state constitution, it certainly seems like any impeachment would be well outside of anything that the Constitution has authorized. And then strange issues could arise also if there's an impeachment but not a Senate vote, because of this provision in our Constitution that says that you can't sit if you're a judge after you've been impeached, but before there's a ruling in the trial, which would happen before the Senate. So I think there's certainly possible litigation that will unfold. But I also think it's important to emphasize here that what's really going on is an effort to undo what the voters decided this past spring. The arguments that have been made in favor of impeachment are incredibly weak. They come nowhere close to, if you look back at the one other impeachment of a justice in Wisconsin, the allegations there were dramatically different from what's been alleged here. And that person was acquitted, by the way. We just saw Ken Paxton in Texas acquitted. And so, the idea that impeachment is at all appropriate here, I think, is absurd, and I'm hopeful that effort won't move forward.
The legislature would have the first pass at determining, right, if she committed an impeachable offense. So in theory, could a court weigh in and say she hasn't? How would that process play out, right? If it's in Dane County Circuit Court here and then it gets appealed, ultimately couldn't it end up before the state Supreme Court to determine if she committed an impeachable offense or not? Yeah,
so first I'd need to say, to do political reporting in Wisconsin, you also need to be a legal reporter, and this emphasizes the point. So it could happen a few different ways. It could be that somebody brings a suit prior to any impeachment action going forward.
Which we see.
That happens sometimes. If you take the case that I just mentioned we're involved in with Meagan Wolfe, what happened there was the Senate took a vote, and very shortly thereafter we filed suit, and so you could see something similar happening here. And ultimately, a court will decide what is permissible, what that means for how our state Supreme Court is currently composed. You could get into potentially very complicated issues where the state courts, which are not exactly totally removed from some of these issues, certainly not the Supreme Court, is having to weigh in on these issues. And so it could happen at any number of points in time, likely either sort of before a vote happens, though, or after an assembly vote happens. There could be litigation over how quickly the Senate needs to act if an impeachment happens. So you just need to be prepared. Typically all this stuff happens on a Friday afternoon, as all reporters know. So which Friday afternoon I can't tell you, but that's right.
Yeah. What about, I've heard some legal scholars talk about this idea that if the Senate sits, if they impeach her in the Assembly and the Senate sits on holding a trial, that the governor could appoint an interim justice to serve while she's sidelined. What is the logic there? Do you agree with that? Is that something that could happen?
Well, I'm not going to weigh in on the merits of that stuff now, but what I can tell you is the logic is a couple things. One is the Constitution says that when there's an impeachment, the Senate shall act. It's clear that the Senate is not supposed to just sit on it and leave a justice sidelined. It's supposed to act. Secondly, our state Supreme Court says that our Constitution says that our state Supreme Court shall have 7 justices. So if you have somebody who is not able to serve in any cases, does that raise constitutional concerns there? And then third, there's obviously a huge separation of powers issue here. If you've got the legislature able to shape the way that the Supreme Court is composed, and I would add, here it's not just about how it's composed in general. The legislature has been pretty open that they're trying to shape the results of a particular case. So you not just have the legislature affecting the way the court is composed, but potentially trying to influence the decision in a specific case. That is an authority of our courts, not of our legislature. So I suspect we could see some of those arguments, but what arguments are brought remains to be seen.
Thanks for being here this morning. I'm Randy from West Virginia Public Broadcasting. I just want to know how your personal, social, and religious views impact the legal decisions that you make, and what are your thoughts on that issue in general?
Great. Well, first, when I'm at the AG conferences, I sit next to your AG because Wisconsin and West Virginia are next to each other in the alphabet. So we don't necessarily agree on every issue, as you may have seen. But we have had the chance to sit next to each other a few times. Here's what I can say. One of the questions I get asked sometimes is, why is your job a partisan office to begin with? And I think that's a very fair question. And like a lot of states, the history behind what happened is not totally consistent with how things have played out. So in Wisconsin, our mayors and our county executives, they're elected on a nonpartisan basis. But sheriffs and district attorneys and the AG are all elected on a partisan basis. And I think if you take a step back and think, is that the way we really should be doing it, you might make those decisions somewhat differently. That being said, there's no question that AGs, and to some extent, folks in other jobs that involve enforcement of the laws, that the approach that they take on certain issues is impacted by their policy views. So there are some places where those views really have no impact, and they shouldn't have an impact. As an example, if we've got a potential legal violation, we should not consider, and I hope nobody who's a prosecutor or an investigator considers the partisan affiliation of the person who may have committed the crime, or whether their industry is one that supports one party or another. The enforcement of the laws has to be neutral in that respect. And when it's not, I think that can lead to very bad consequences for those prosecutions. I think that's where we start to see acquittals. And I would submit that the Durham investigations and the results of some of their prosecutions are an example of that. Now, where our enforcement priorities lie, that's something that is shaped by policy views to some degree, because there's a wide range of laws out there to be enforced, and where you put your resources can vary quite a bit. One area we see that is on white-collar crime and the enforcement of white-collar laws. I believe those laws need to be enforced just like all of our other laws. Environmental enforcement is an example where our enforcement has been clearly more aggressive than my predecessor's enforcement of it was. And I think that when people vote for offices like Attorney General, they have some sense that if you want clean water protected more aggressively, this is your candidate. If you're looking for somebody who's going to take more of a hands-off approach, this is your candidate. And then in a lot of the multi-state actions we see with challenges to federal policy, we don't have to be involved in any challenge to any federal policy. We don't have an obligation to do that, but we can do that. And so when the federal government adopts a regulation or passes a law that we believe is unlawful or unconstitutional, one of the things we consider, and I think any AG should consider, is this policy harmful to our state and to our residents? If it's not, why are we wasting resources challenging it? But if it is, and we've got a good legal basis for challenging it, this is a good place for us to get involved. But my views on what policies are harmful to the state are different than my predecessors certainly were. We've been on opposite sides of environmental issues, for example. So those types of issues shape priorities when it comes to resource allocation, or enforcement areas in general, and I think that that's appropriate. That's why we have elections. But in terms of the specifics of how which cases are brought, from an enforcement standpoint, there I think it's, we have an obligation to be neutral and not to let our policy priorities seep in.
Haley B. Miller with the Columbus Dispatch and USA Today Network in Ohio. Kind of piggybacking off of that, we've seen with the Trump investigations, you probably have faced this in some of your own prosecutions, that because attorneys general are partisan, or maybe prosecutors are part of a partisan administration, people say that these are politically motivated, that they aren't credible because of that. How do you sort of assure voters that these prosecutions are legitimate, even if you're a Democrat? And is there anything reporters can do better or do more of to sort of underscore the legitimacy of these?
Yeah, so first, welcome back to Wisconsin, Haley. For those of you who don't know, Haley was here in Wisconsin previously. I'm sure it's much less interesting and slow in Ohio than it is here. But thank you for the question. So I read the book On Tyranny recently, which came out in, I think it was 2017. And one of the points that they made in that book was defend institutions. Now, whether that's a responsibility for the press or for elected officials or who exactly is a fair question. But one of the things we've seen as part of these attacks on our democracy is attacks on institutions. And that includes the press, it includes election officials, but it also includes our justice system. I mean, we have seen attacks on the FBI, we've seen attacks on the neutral administration of justice. And it is an appropriate subject of inquiry to see are the laws being neutrally administered? Are they being fairly applied? And I think there are times when I just myself mentioned the Durham investigation, where I think that we haven't had that faithfully done. But there we've got some clear results that reflect that. We've got acquittals in cases. As you heard before, I'm a former federal prosecutor. Acquittals in federal prosecutions are not very common, and yet it happened there, which is a sign that something may have gone wrong. What I think is key is not to amplify the attacks. One of the things that is a concern of mine, and I think others, is you'll sometimes see a Truth Social post that then just gets posted as a tweet with maybe a sentence commenting on it, but effectively is spreading a message. And I'll give you a specific example. Recently, we've had all these attacks on Jack Smith. I'm not going to repeat the former president's words, but probably everybody here has heard what he has said because those attacks have been amplified. Repeating verbatim what people are saying at a time when they know that there's not as much penalty for falsehoods as there is benefit from their political perspective, I think is really it's something that needs to be done very thoughtfully, characterizing what has been said and providing the context, which is, criminal defendant attacks prosecutor, is a very different story than former president makes this allegation. So that context, I think, is so critical to conveying, not just in the 12th paragraph of a story, but in the headlines. The statement itself is often not the most newsworthy part, in my view. It's what is underlying it, what's motivating it, what's the context for that statement. And I do think that I was just reading a Wall Street Journal story about the frostiness of the relationship between the U.S. Attorney General and the president. I have no idea if that's accurate or not, but in a way, that's how that relationship is supposed to be. The AG needs to be independent. The administration of justice needs to be independent, and where there are reasons to think it's not, it's important to call that out. But where there are reasons to think that the attacks on the administration are themselves motivated by bad faith, I think that's also very important.
Hi there. Thank you so much for speaking with us. I'm Samantha from the Boston Globe. In Massachusetts, our attorneys general have a long history of being in leadership roles in the Democratic Attorneys General Association. And when you were talking about kind of the importance of neutrality, I'm curious about how you see the role of groups like the Democratic AGs or the Republican AGs and kind of, the role that they play, and kind of curious about your, involvement.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first I miss having Maura Healey as a colleague, but we're thrilled to have Andrea now. So if you go back a few decades, the AG community was, I think, very bipartisan. There was a group called the National Association of AGs, and AGs work together across the aisle in lots of ways. In the last decade, roughly, there has been more partisanship in those elections, including with the development of the Democratic AGs Association, which actually was preceded by the Republican AGs Association. Our system doesn't work if you've got one group for one party but not a comparable group. And I think that there are some elements of those organizations that make a lot of sense. There are multi-state efforts where Republican AGs right now are joining together to sue President Biden. Those are not meetings you'd have at a National Association of AGs event where you may have AGs who will be filing briefs on the other side of that case. So there is a place for that. But I am concerned about the extent to which the elections have become politicized. We're now seeing within the Republican Party some efforts to run out incumbents who are viewed as not sufficiently partisan. In Idaho recently, for example, the AG there, who I think had served 4 terms, was defeated in a primary. What I will say is I do think our space remains one, and election administrators are probably another, where there is still a lot of bipartisanship. We work together on the opioid cases, for example, and I think it is fundamentally important that we continue to do so. But at a time where law and litigation is playing such a role in what's happening federally, you're going to see partisan differences and folks who are members of the same party working together. I think in the abstract we would all like to go back to the system where there's less partisanship, but as a practical matter, I think that won't start to happen until one of the things that has precipitated that, which is a lot of administrative action federally that has led to lawsuits, is dialed back, and there are fewer suits that end up happening.
You mentioned North Carolina. I'm Dawn Vaughn, the Capitol Bureau Chief for the Raleigh News and Observer. So I actually didn't know which reference you were making to things that happened in North Carolina, so that's one of my questions. But also about separation of powers. There's, when you were talking about when we think about how to do a headline, the boring headline is legislature wants to be able to appoint more positions to boards and commissions that have oversight of it's very boring, but it's actually a power grab. That's a separation of powers, so the balance there. But there's a bill now, which Democratic Governor Cooper vetoed, that the Republican supermajority will override whenever they feel like it at some point this fall. And it is that taking away some of those boards and appointments, and it's not as whiz-bang as some of like a special session, but it's sort of, appointment here, appointment there. And I wanted to get your take on that. And also because a lot of the reason some say they're doing it is, Cooper's a lame duck, but our Attorney General, Josh Stein, is running for governor. So is it, it's something thinking ahead politically with that sort of move? Of course, the Republican could also win. And then, so it's an either or on, I don't know if that's been seen in other states where it's just, a seat here, a seat there for things that kind of fly under most people's radar, I think.
Yeah. So first, I could mention a lot of things in North Carolina, but in fairness, I could about Wisconsin too. So I actually was prior to being AG, I did a lot of voting rights litigation, and one of the cases I worked on was a very significant voting rights trial in North Carolina. There was legislation passed that ultimately was struck down by the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals that was found to have targeted black voters with, and this is what the court said, with surgical precision. As an aside, there were more lawyers involved in that case than any case I'm aware of. But Josh Stein, actually, who was a state senator at the time, testified at that trial. And I will note that for a period of time, we had 3 swing state AGs named Josh. So it was a very exciting time for Josh AGs. But now Shapiro has moved elsewhere, and Stein is running for governor. But anyway, so North Carolina, like Wisconsin, has had this history of partisan polarization, hyper-gerrymandering, efforts by one party to undermine the ability of the other party to serve in their offices, really. And so that's part of what I was referring to. This was before our lame duck session. I don't remember if you had a special session also at some point.
It's just kind of a never-ending session that comes and goes.
Fair enough.
Right.
So what I think, though, is really significant, and this is part of my point about context, is are the claims that people are making good faith claims? And I think one way you can get at that question is by looking at what the claims they've made at other points in time are. So when we had our lame duck session here, the argument that was made by our legislature, and it continues to be made in court, is, well, this isn't a power grab. We're just balancing power between the executive branch and the legislative branch, having ignored that concern for the prior 8 years. Pointing out that they never found the need to do that prior to these elections that just happened, and yet now are rushing into special session to do it, I think is a significant fact. When our speaker purports to be in favor of nonpartisan election administration in Wisconsin, having previously attacked the model he now purports to be using, I think that context is important, because what started happening in politics is that we've seen certain political actors throughout whatever argument is convenient at the time, and often on the face of it, it's not an unreasonable argument, or at least not one where you'd say they're obviously not being straightforward about what the motivation is here. But when you look behind at what motivated that, or what the history is, I think you can often provide citizens and readers with a lot more context. And so if you're in favor of the governor having a particular appointment power when the governor is a member of your party, but against it when the governor is a member of another party, that calls into question whether the arguments you're making are really legitimate arguments, or if you're just trying to grab power.
Hannah Wiley with the LA Times. Last week, a small group of California Democrats asked the state attorney general to exclude Trump from the ballot next year. Basically, their legal theory is that the alleged crimes on January 6th disqualify him from appearing on the ballot. I know Colorado has made a similar move. I'm really curious to hear your thoughts on that legal theory and how you would handle that request. Should it would never happen in Wisconsin, right? But should that happen?
Yeah. So first, our office may end up being involved in litigation over this, or engaged in it one way or another, because we are just often involved in that type of litigation. And so I'm not going to weigh in on the merits of the arguments, but what I can say is a few things. First, it's clear that this is an issue that is now going to be in front of at least some election officials. There's a case filed in Colorado. I believe there has been discussion at least of filing other cases. What happens will vary by state. I suspect in a lot of places you will see secretaries of state or their equivalent making initial determinations about that. What I think is going to happen ultimately, though, is that this is an issue that's going to be decided by the courts. There are serious constitutional arguments that have been made. There are a couple conservative legal scholars who have really been the ones who've put forward this theory. And so, we'll see where the legal debate shakes out. But I also think there's a practical element here that I don't know has gotten the attention it should, which is I think this is going to end up in front of the courts. In fact, there already is a pending court case. And in particular, I think it's going to end up before the U.S. Supreme Court. And so I do think people who are advocating for this should ask themselves the question, how do you think the U.S. Supreme Court is going to come out on this issue? This is a court that overturned Roe versus Wade. It gutted the Voting Rights Act. And so I think if people are suggesting that this is likely to end up with a disqualification of a candidate, it's hard to see how that happens with the current U.S. Supreme Court, just as a descriptive matter. Now, lawyers are going to have to make their best legal assessment. Secretaries of State will have to analyze the issue. But I do think that figuring out where this is likely to end is an important part of this story, and it seems hard to imagine it doesn't end up at the U.S. Supreme Court.
Can you expand on your office's role, like what you anticipate your office's role being?
It will depend on the specifics. What I can tell you is what we do generally with election type of questions. One is we provide legal guidance to state agencies generally. That can include our election commission. It's up to the election commission to determine when they want to seek that guidance. We have a bipartisan commission that votes sometimes 3-3, sometimes 6-0 on issues that come before the commission. So if that issue comes up before our commission, they would ultimately take a vote on it. And then in litigation, we're often involved. And so just to give you sort of a different but somewhat similar example, prior to the vote in our state senate on our election administrator, I sent a letter to the council, legislative council, which is the council for our legislators, explaining why the Senate didn't have the authority to take the vote that they did, and explained that we had been representing our election commission in connection with that issue. And then when legal action needed to be taken because the Senate had gone forward, we filed the suit. So that's an example of the way we are involved in elections, but I think that just in general, that's our role in election administration. Each state, the role varies, but I think often AGs are in a similar position.
As a reporter, I hate to be a timekeeper on an interesting back and forth like this. So maybe we'll just grab them and put them in another room, and we can keep going at them. But I want to be respectful of the Attorney General's time. So maybe one more question, and then we can allow him to go.
Hi, I'm Blair with the Daily Montanan. Sort of a abstract question, I guess, but how do you see your role in that of other attorneys general? Is A, like centering the truth publicly, and B, sort of protecting the separation of powers? And the context I'll give for that is our Attorney General faces 41 ethics complaints currently, and he's used that as a political cudgel, saying it's all partisan, and then the executive and the legislature have both been trying to grab power all spring, basically, away from the judiciary especially. But in public, I think that's something that elected officials and us as journalists have been trying to sort of figure out how to parse for regular citizens, and I was curious how you see your role in that.
Yeah, it's a great question. So one thing that is kind of interesting about my role, it's not unique to this job, but it's certainly true, is you can have two AGs in the same state who would spend their time totally differently. And to some degree, I do spend my time differently than my predecessor. There are, conferences you can go to and groups you can speak to and issues you can take up or not take up. There's involvement in, cases to a greater or lesser degree. And so prioritizing is important. And to me, prioritizing what are the most significant issues of our time is what we strive to do. One of them is, I do think that we've got a role to play in speaking the truth and advocating for the facts. I mentioned before the importance of institutions in the current context, and attacks on just what the truth is or debates about what the facts are has unfortunately become a big part of our political discourse. And the more that folks are out there conveying the truth of the matter, I think the better off we are, whatever the issue is. In terms of the separation of powers, it is my hope that my colleagues take the long view and think through what kind of legacy we want to leave when it comes to our democracy, our separation of powers, our Constitution, both the U.S. Constitution and our state constitutions. But there are clearly some folks who don't take that view and are trying to gain power. Now, I do think voters don't want to see politicians trying to empower themselves, and I do think one way we can help demonstrate the harm from some of the anti-democratic actions we're seeing is to talk about that not just on the theoretical plane and not just in the abstract about democracy, but about the real life consequences that this has for people. In Wisconsin, it has meant a meaningful difference in where we are on policy on a variety of issues. I could go through them all, but there are a whole host of them from where we would be if the voters really were in control of our legislature. Likewise, there are real consequences to not having independent courts or not having an ethics system. It can result in corruption. It can result in people not getting their fair day before the courts. And so linking what is happening and thinking about it not through the sort of horse race lens or the political battle lens, but rather through the lens of what is the impact of this on people in our communities, I think is a really important component of those stories. It's not easy. It's easy to cover the political back and forth, but the real life consequences of that are why it's so important.
I wanted to thank the Attorney General for in all of the options that he has to spend his time with, one group or another, that he chose to be here with us this morning. And I just have one parting question. You've been asked this before. I'll try to put a different spin on it, about the Wisconsin fake electors and whether you believe they're worthy of prosecution here, or is the federal system the better venue for that type of a case?
Yeah, I can say a few things, and there are a few things I can't say. So first, I think anybody who committed a crime with the goal of overturning the results of our elections needs to be held accountable. Now, where that happens or how that happens is a matter that I think requires a lot of thought. I do not comment, generally speaking, on investigations that our office is or could be conducting, and I'm sticking with that with respect to this issue. But I can say first, I fully support what's happening federally. I think it's vital that the Jack Smith investigation continues, and I expect that we will see further developments. As you all know, there were, I believe, 6 unindicted co-conspirators named in the indictment. It certainly wouldn't be a surprise to see further indictments based on what's been charged so far. I think it is critical in any investigation that the people most responsible bear the most accountability, and I think that's reflected in the Jack Smith indictment. And then I would add 2 points. One is, in any investigation, and I was a federal prosecutor before, I've looked at this from that lens previously, it's important that if you can avoid it, that you don't have parallel investigations but separate investigations into the same conduct. And the reason for that is you don't want to have a grand jury transcript in one case that prosecutors in another case aren't aware of, because it can cause major problems in their prosecution as they move forward. So I think it's important that efforts be coordinated where they can be. And then secondly, it's not at all uncommon for evidence from a federal investigation to be used in state-level prosecutions. Whether that will happen here or anywhere else remains to be seen, but ultimately charging decisions will be made by DAs, I think, around the country, or state's attorneys and their equivalents. So that's as much as I can say on that at this point.
Well, again, many thanks for joining us here today. I think we've learned a lot.
Thank you.